Our next speaker this morning is Jared Messick. Jared earned his PhD studying the human dimensions of wildlife at Texas State University, and he is passionate about conducting research to bridge the gaps between wildlife conservation and public well-being. Please join me in welcoming Jared.
All right. Good morning, guys. How y'all doing? Good. Okay. I teach 2 classes of organismal bio, and that's about the response I get every day I teach. So you guys are, yeah, we're getting there. Anyway, my name is Dr. Jared Messick. I'm here to talk to you guys about some research that we've done over at Texas State in the Serenari lab. We got Christopher Serenari back there. Where's he at? He supervises our lab. So I've worked with him for the past 5 years. We've been funded by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, been able to do some awesome research out in East Central Texas with this guy. I guess I should have put a golden-cheeked warbler or something up here. But every time I mention East Central Texas or Houston toads, please just think of the hill country and of golden-cheeked warblers, okay? So today what we're going to do is I'm going to run you through really a background on landowner-land relationships. Okay, and how landowners derive meaning from these relationships. We'll talk about how that plays in to private lands conservation. Then I'll run you through the research projects that we conducted over the past 5 years. We'll end with some conclusions and next steps and a question and answer session. So, Rachel spoke a lot about how much of Texas is privately owned. So that trend persists for the majority of the United States. Okay, about 75% of each state is held in private ownership. So it's really not that much of a leap to suggest that how and why landowners engage with their property the way that they do determines what happens for wildlife and endangered species found across terrestrial habitats in America. Okay, now studies of landowner-land relationships and the hows and whys have uncovered that what's driving these relationships are landowner values. Okay, and values, kind of like stewardship, can become kind of this nebulous, really abstract idea. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to refer to values as just the meanings that landowners associate with relationships with their property. Okay, what do these relationships mean to people? The good news is that a lot of scholars that study landowner-land relationships have arrived at the conclusion that landowners overall approach their property through some lens of environmental stewardship. Okay, for the most part, people are out there that want to take good care of their property. The interesting thing, though, for wildlife and endangered species that exist on these properties is that environmental stewardship is not the only meaning that landowners associate with these relationships. Okay, they associate farming heritage, agricultural production, social and personal well-being, a whole bunch of different meanings with these relationships, right? So what we end up with are a bunch of different parcels that are all being taken care of by different people, but with extremely variable outcomes for wildlife and endangered species. To exemplify this, I went out and did some research in East Central Texas. In 2019, I went to talk to people on their property, and I asked them about, why they did what they did on their property. Okay, so I talked to 2 different farmers, and I promise this isn't their property, so if I talk to you, I did not put your picture up online. We got Farmer Joe and Farmer John. Okay, both of them expressed that they approached their land through a lens of environmental stewardship. Okay, they valued the opportunity to take care of their property. They even used the same exact verbiage, which I thought was pretty crazy. Okay, but what their land looked like was totally different. Okay, Farmer Joe, he also associated values of farm heritage and agricultural production value with the relationship with his land. Okay, that led him to plant non-native grasses, improve pastures, run cattle, and minimize wildlife habitat on his property. Farmer John, on the other hand, he associated the responsibility to restore native ecosystems to his relationship with his property. He also valued opportunities to engage with wildlife agencies. This led him to plant native grasses and to encourage habitat that would bring back things like Atwater prairie chickens and bobwhite quail. So what we end up with across a landscape like Texas that's 95% privately owned, or we end up with a bunch of isolated habitat patches on private lands being taken care of by the landowner based on their personal notion of what it means to take care of the property. Okay, so is what's best for wildlife actually being done on private lands? That's the question. And more or less, we kind of have to flip the coin. Okay, is wildlife being taken care of on this property? To improve wildlife outcomes on private lands, one of the main approaches that wildlife agencies use, or one of the popular approaches, right? We won't say main approach, but one of the popular approaches is to give landowners incentives to kind of buy conservation behavior. Okay, we get landowners enrolled in voluntary incentive programs. What happens though is that these programs are designed by the agencies. Okay, so oftentimes landowners may become disinterested in programs if they don't necessarily align with the relationship that a landowner already has with their property. That's because programs, through their rules, goals, and requirements, articulate their own values. And that may seem a little bit abstract, but really what a program is doing is it's dictating what an appropriate relationship with the land looks like. Okay, so if that program's notion of appropriate values with the land conflicts with the way that a landowner wants to engage with their property, we may be able to explain some of the disinterest we see when we talk about incentive programs and we're trying to get landowners involved in these programs to actually improve wildlife outcomes on private property. Okay, so to put this idea to the test, I went out in 2019 and 2020 and I interviewed landowners on their property. Okay, I wanted to assess and understand the values that they associated with their land, with the relational processes that they engaged with, and I wanted to understand the interaction between landowners and then an incentive program for the critically endangered Houston toad. Okay, now the incentive program in question was the Programmatic Safe Harbor Agreement. It's administered by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and was rolled out in 2017. So what I found upon my interviews with landowners was that there were important points of alignment and contention between landowner values and the values that were articulated by the Safe Harbor Agreement. In particular, one of the main conflicts that kept landowners out of the program was that they valued the opportunity to be in control of what happened on their property, okay? That's autonomy. They wanted to be in control and make these sovereign decisions, but being enrolled in an incentive program requires you to give up property access, it requires you to sign a contract, and to do certain things on your property that you might not otherwise have done. Okay, so that example of a value conflict right there was enough to keep a lot of landowners out of this program. So moving forward, it's fair to suggest that value misalignment between landowners and incentive programs is enough to create some of these adverse outcomes for wildlife on private lands if one of the main tools that we're using to improve said outcomes are incentive programs. Okay, so our options are twofold. We can approach the problem from the governmental perspective and try to change the way that the values of governmental programs and policies are perceived, or we can take it from a landowner perspective, okay, and we can try to influence landowner values. Okay, let's take option A first. Let's talk about governance and governance values. So when I talk about changing governance and changing governmental structures, the knee-jerk, easy cop-out reaction is to say, start from scratch, burn it all down, scrap the ESA, it doesn't matter. But I want to suggest to you that that solution and reforming these large-scale governance structures is going to take time. Okay, and it may not be realistic in the lifespan of a single species like the Houston toad that's critically endangered, right? So we need policies and programs or strategies that can be enrolled and enacted now, okay, and acted on. So that might sound pie in the sky, but remember, the conflict between landowners and the Safe Harbor Agreement that I discussed in Project 1 was all perceived, okay? They perceived value misalignment with the program. So really, we're not talking about necessarily changing a program. We're talking about changing the way that people think about these programs, okay, about the way that these programs are perceived by the populace. Okay, so that makes this task about changing governance structures, when we put it in terms of changing perceptions of these structures, it makes it a lot more approachable. Okay, there are plenty of strategies and paradigms and schools of study and thought that go out to changing audience perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors. Okay, during my PhD study, I stumbled upon a really cool idea called strategic communication. And it sounds really common sense, but there have been a lot of people that have devoted a lot of time to this idea, no matter how common sense it sounds. So it's just communication that's used by an organization to accomplish a common goal. Okay, and usually these goals are to change the attitudes and perceptions of their audience. Okay, so that's just what we were talking about, right, with changing perceptions of governance structures. Strategic communication has been used by political campaign activists, by public health campaigners to do things like increase and improve or change voting behavior, right? Who are you going to vote for? And to reduce harmful behaviors like smoking. Okay, so if it can be used in public health and political activation campaigns, why can't it be used in a conservation context, right? To improve outcomes for wildlife species. So it's not that it can't be done. It's that it hasn't been done, okay? At least in the context of incentive programs for endangered species, right? We're working in kind of this niche area, but there are wide overlaps with what we're doing here at this symposium as well. So what we have to do is we have to understand the strategic communication process. And it begins with knowing your audience, okay? With segmenting your audience into different groups of people based on the types of messages and communications they need to accomplish the organizational goal. Right, in this case, our organizational goal is to improve wildlife outcomes via incentive programs. Okay, so we have to know our audience. We have to know what they expect from a communicator, and we have to know what they expect from the messages that they receive. We also have to understand the types of messages that we're going to send to people to try and change their behavior or perceptions. Okay, that includes knowing about the information that we need to say. That's our message content. We have to know how we're going to say that stuff, which is message framing. And we also even have to know the channel that we're going to send those messages through. Okay, because whether we email, blast somebody in their face with strategic communication about safe harbor agreements, or we call them on the phone, we do whatever, all of those things communicate meaning. Okay, so our goal with the second project was to actually, from start to finish, prescribe Texas Parks and Wildlife Department with a strategic communication plan that they could use to get landowners involved in the same program for the for the Houston toad, that programmatic safe harbor agreement. We wrapped this program up in 2023, and I graduated with my dissertation, thank the Lord, in 2023 as well. And this was our calling card here, and we were able to give Texas Parks and Wildlife Department a 3-tier communication strategy that they could use to hopefully improve outcomes for wildlife and the Houston toad, right? So we told them how to segment audiences, okay? We want to segment audiences and talk to different groups of people based on the way that they view relationships with the land from a conservation standpoint, okay? Are they out there conserving endangered species? Are they taking a more holistic approach to landscape scale conservation? Or is this someone that really just wants to be involved in a community about conservation? Okay, there was kind of our 3D model of segmentation for stewardship there. We also found out that the way that communicators approach these issues is important, okay, and that agency behavior plays a role in how audiences like landowners perceive a communication that they receive. And we also found out that even though a lot of us think that face-to-face communications are the most powerful form of communication, and I'm not going to say that that's not true, right? I do agree with that. But our findings provided evidence that when landowners lack awareness and experience with a given program, they may be less inclined to respond positively to something that they don't know about if you're talking about them face-to-face. Okay? Now, the interesting part is that we were actually able to show that some of our strategic communications can positively influence perceptions towards safe harbor agreements and endangered species conservation, and even could increase intention to enroll or to seek information about the program. So we sent out experimental messages to landowners as part of the survey that we conducted. And we found that when we provide content about ecosystems as a whole, as opposed to information about single species, that landowners expressed an increase in positivity towards safe harbor agreement and endangered species conservation. Okay, and when we framed that content in alignment with the way that landowners value relationships with their land, particularly with regards to their commitment to conservation and their desire to protect their property rights, this could also improve their attitudes towards safe harbor agreements. Okay, so strategic communication can actually work in this context. It's just, do we have the capacity to implement this solution? Yes, we do. This is an example of us actually implementing the solution. Okay, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department in the summer of 2022 put on some wildlife workshops. Now, the goal of these workshops was to introduce Houston toads and safe harbor agreements to landowners. Okay, but we know based on our findings from our second project that you can't just tell people about endangered species and expect to appeal to a wide audience. Okay, so what we did were we designed flyers based on these findings. We have a flyer on the right-hand side of the screen that has no endangered species on it. And then we have a flyer on the left-hand side of the screen that kind of highlights that idea that we're going to have some Houston toads at these workshops. Okay, and we had a pretty great turnout for the workshops, and we didn't test the effectiveness of these, but the take home here is that these strategies are readily implementable solutions, okay, and that they can be implemented without overhauling governance structures. So we tackled A. We talked about how communication strategies and how changing perceptions of governance structures can kind of bridge this gap and misalignment that exists between landowners and things like incentive programs, and that can kind of perpetuate different outcomes for wildlife on private lands. So what about solution B, though? Solution B is attacking it for the other end of the spectrum and actually trying to leverage values that landowners have regarding relationships with their land. Okay, this research hasn't happened yet for us. This is a project that we're very excited to start in 2024 in the fall. So hopefully we'll be able to talk to you guys about this next year maybe. But it's based on a story that I want to tell you about Farmer John, okay, from that first slide. So the idea here is that potentially we can override value conflicts that exist between landowners and programs by supplementing and supporting the values that are actually in alignment already. Okay, because not every value that a landowner had was contradicted or undermined by an incentive programs. It's just sometimes the value conflicts were too much, okay, and the values that were aligned got swept under the rug. Okay, but the idea here is that we want to supplement and support the values that align through the impartation of social resources, okay, through interactions. These interactions are formally known as social exchanges. Okay, so back to Farmer John, right? Farmer John, when we first proposed safe harbor agreements to him, and I didn't do this, somebody else did, right? When safe harbors were proposed to him, he wasn't on board. Okay, that's because he valued the autonomy that was associated with his relationship with the property. He liked making decisions. Okay, but remember, he also valued the opportunity to engage with agency staff about conservation. Okay, so he had a trusted agency friend approach him and pour resources into him. He gave him know-how, he gave him information, and just this relationship was actually enough to tip the scales in favor of Farmer John getting involved in a safe harbor agreement. Okay, so supplementing the values that were aligned between the safe harbor agreement and Farmer John were actually enough to overcome the value conflict. Okay, so in Project 3, our goal is to understand the different costs that are associated with value conflicts and see what types of supplementations are required to overcome these value conflicts. So stay tuned for that. We're very excited. In conclusion, though, we found out that conservation outcomes are related to the way that landowners engage with their property. Okay, and whether or not landowners are actually taking good care of their property, a tool that is used to improve that outcome, right, that landowners actually do what's best for their land, are incentive programs. And the way that incentive programs work right now can be improved upon. Okay, there's drastic room for improvement with how many landowners we enroll, with how many acres that we protect. Okay, but as is, those goals may not be accomplished if we don't do anything to change either the structures that we govern with or the perceptions of those governance structures. Okay, and we'll be able to talk about landowners more next time. So what do? First of all, we do more research like this. Okay, we understand landowners. We understand the way that they value relationships with their property. Okay, because these things can be used by agencies right now, today or tomorrow, to begin to improve wildlife outcomes on private lands. okay? And then we got to do a little bit of work with step 2, the work that we just talked about. Okay, we have to conduct some strategic communication. We have to alter the way that we talk about programs and policies. And then in the long term, we get to step 3, okay? And that's where we can actually start thinking about transformation from a governmental perspective, changing the way that we actually do conservation, the way that we design policies and programs for private landowners. But anyway, thank you so much for your time. Does anyone have any questions? What's up? The question was if there was a lot of interaction with Texas Parks at the workshops, correct? Okay. I think so. I think we got some Texas Parks folks that may have been there. It certainly looked like there was a lot of interaction with Texas Parks and Wildlife staff. I was there to collect data, okay? So I wasn't actually a fly on the wall, maybe like I should have been. I was conducting interviews at these workshops, okay? So I was pretty busy, but people wanted to talk to me, so that counts. Yeah, so did these workshops relate to landowners being more involved in the programs, right? And so over the course of our research program, there has been an increase in the number of landowners and the number of acreages protected under the Safe Harbor Agreement for the Houston toad. Now, whether that's related directly to the workshop attendance, I can't say, but it has improved throughout this 5-year research project. Yes. Yes, sir. I'm going to send you my dissertation. No, so the question was, how do we measure what we were actually saying that we found, right? So what we did, sir, is we measured these in the survey, really. So we sent out a survey to 9,600 landowners in East Central Texas, and embedded in the survey was a message experiment. Okay, so we asked landowners a suite of questions about their attitudes and behavioral intention towards endangered species conservation and safe harbor agreements. Then we gave them one of 7 experimental messages. Okay, it contained information about the safe harbor agreement, but it either was tailored towards wildlife or Houston toad conservation. Those were our 2 content variants. Or it was framed according to different landowner values, right, which were conservation, protect your property rights, and then social relationships. So what we did was we conducted a statistical analysis of the difference between the pre and the post-test attitudes, and that's how we actually measured if they changed perceptions. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the question was, do I feel that my role as a researcher kind of was a bridge between landowners and the program? And to be honest, I don't think it's supposed to be. But in some cases, I'm sure that that's how landowners ended up learning about the program. And maybe that was enough to spark some interest. I was actually told by Farmer Joe during our interview that the only reason that he was talking to me was because I was a student. Okay, and because I was a researcher. So maybe not my role as a researcher, but my role as a student that cared about the environment and cared about the people, I think that definitely served as maybe not a bridge between the agency and between the landowner, but as definitely an opportunity to get a conversation started.